Hello and welcome to the Mr. Feels podcast. I'm your host, Tyler May.
And I'm your other host, Laura Benson.
And this week we're here with Laura's friend and collaborator, Stellar.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have Stellar on board. She and I have known each other for almost 10 years at this point, actually. And we've played music together for much of that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I know her from Austin, Texas, and from California and everywhere in between. And she has a lot of experience with mental health and especially anxiety and depression. And I've always been really inspired by how she works through it and how aware she is of all of the things she's going through and how she communicates about it. And she's actually been a wonderful resource for me throughout my own experience. So, hello, Stellar.
Hello.
Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
We're very excited that you're here.
I'm stoked.
I'm so pumped to hear so much about your story. I've been getting a little bit of tidbits here and there of just talking a little bit before the show with Stellar and Laura, and I'm just been like hearing it, and I'm getting like little things and like, oh no, we're gonna relate so much on this issue, and so I'm really excited to like go through your story and everything. So do you want to just start by kind of taking us through like your mental health journey?
Oh, sure. No problem.
Yeah, that's not a big question at all. You want to just tell us your life story?
Yeah, there you go. So, it's hard to tell like when something begins. But I first started becoming aware that all was not well probably about 10 years ago, almost.
Right when we met.
Pretty much. a little before, yeah. Yeah, and I just noticed that, I kind of graduated from college and just noticed that I had no more energy to like do things ever.
Yeah.
And that kind of day-to-day existence was like difficult. It's one of those things where you don't really notice how bad things have gotten until someone like points it out to you and says, hey, by the way, that's a thing. Like that. I know you think this is existence, but this is actually a thing. And the first time I can remember realizing that what I was struggling with was chronic major depression was when I shared with a friend who happened to be a therapist that I was having trouble eating because I never knew what to eat.
Oh, interesting.
And that every time I would realize that not that I was hungry, but that I should probably eat something. And I knew how to cook, like I knew how to, I was a fairly functional like person before all of this came down, but everything I'd ever cooked and pretty much everything that I'd ever eaten would just sort of like fly out of my head. And I like would open the fridge and stare and then close it. And just go hungry, which is right. It's such a.
I'm just having flashbacks to like my moment of just like looking at like a pile of clothes and like not knowing how to like put on a t-shirt and feeling like I'm like I can't like how do people dress themselves? Like I don't know. I'm just like now being past that, it's just like you almost can't remember that, but then again another side of you just like. I kind of remember it really clearly, and like it's oh man, all right, go ahead.
Yeah, and
I'm relating
totally.
a lot.
And if you're listening and you're in that space right now, like it's totally a thing. Like you're not a failure. You're not like. Can we swear on this podcast?
I don't know. We haven't really decided. Can we?
We try not to a lot, but like you can say whatever you want.
An F up? Do you want to say an F up?
Yeah, basically.
You're not an F up.
Right. So if you're listening and you're like in that space right now, like you're not a failure. Chemicals in your body have like basically, because I remember what my therapist friend said, he snapped his fingers.
Oh, wow.
And he was like, that's depression. And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, in depressive states, the memory part of your brain becomes inaccessible. So like you actually lose the ability to see anything like inside of your head. All you can see and deal with is what's right in front of you. You basically lose the ability to like imagine anything. And And, you know, when you're like, oh, I'm hungry, I got to go eat something. Like, you actually have to be able to imagine what you're going to make and eat before you do it. You have to be able to imagine, like, getting up off the couch and doing the laundry. You have to be able to, like, have inertia to see these things. And when we're healthy, like, we just take all that, the energy to do that stuff for granted. But that's one of the things that depression does, is it messes up those neural pathways. So that was when I realized that I had depression. And it was a journey of many years of going deeper and deeper into the hole, and then coming out, and then going deeper again. And I moved to Texas in the meantime. And like, I think my lowest point was a couple of years ago. And of course, the thing that you discover along the way a lot of the time, like, I think depression often shows up in adults who, you know, went through various, like, traumas as children, or just had certain circumstances or certain personalities as children. And I know for me, like, yeah, there was some trauma at home and, like, some intense things going on in my early life. And I was a super anxious child. Like, I was scared a lot. And realizing as an adult, like, oh, again, like, it's like realizing the water that you're swimming in, like, oh, this constant level of anxiety and fear about everything isn't actually normal. Like, what?
Yeah.
Because our systems just, like, get used to certain levels of operation.
Yep.
So realizing that I'd been anxious my whole life, and then as an adult, I'd overcompensated. I worked really hard in school. I basically ran myself into the ground, and then my body just at a certain point was like, I'm done. I can't handle this level of stress. I can't handle this level. I can't handle this level of anxiety. I'm just going to go into, like, deep depression, to basically, like, force you to rest and force you to deal with all the stuff in your life that you haven't dealt with yet.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so my lowest point was probably almost 3 years ago, when things got bad enough where, and they'd sort of been like this for a while, you know, like, where it's really hard to, like, keep your hands on the wheel. You have to, like, focus to not, like, run off the road.
Wow.
And how long were those bouts before that you battled with depression?
Say again.
How long were those bouts that you had? Like the battles of depression. I'm just gonna reword that again and cut that last part out. How long were, like, the battles? How long were, like, the episodes of depression that you had before?
The first depressive episode I had was probably a couple of years long.
Wow.
And that was really before I knew what was going on, you know, because I think it was about, depression hit when I was about 21, as far as a chronic condition that was impacting my life. And it wasn't until I was about 23 or 24 that I even figured out what I was dealing with. Because the general response from people who were around me in my life at the time was like, what's wrong with you? Get your life together, you know?
So during this process, actually, I have a question for you with that. Were you seeing any professionals, or did you have friends that were supporting you, or, like, other than your friend that was the therapist, did you actively seek therapy, or were you pretty much like, oh, okay, I'm experiencing depression, and just really dealing with it on your own?
Once I figured out that the mental state that was governing my life was depression, I immediately started seeking help.
Good.
But before that, I didn't seek help because I didn't know there was anything to seek help for. Like, I just thought I had been doing good in life for a while, and then I'd fallen off and had to get myself back on.
Yeah. Right.
But yeah, I mean, when I moved to Austin, maybe like 6 months after I'd figured out, because right after I figured out that what I was dealing with was depression, my mom got cancer for the second time. And so then I went home and, like, spiraled down super low, but was also, like, lending support to that process and that experience for her. So it really was maybe about a year before I was able to really be in a position to start seeking help for myself. So at my lowest point, I actually did I noticed that I was like, okay, I'm approaching something that might be called suicidal, and I should probably talk to someone, or I should probably do something about this. And
what do you mean by approaching? Like, what kind of thoughts were you having?
It wasn't necessarily a shift in the thoughts. Like I'd had the thoughts for years that I really wasn't quite a fan of being alive anymore, and like wished that I wasn't alive and wished that I didn't have to be alive. What shifted was that I was starting to think about ways to not be alive.
Right. So you were actively beginning to think of suicide.
I was actively ideating. Yeah. About
So you're becoming a risk rather than just thinking suicidal thoughts.
Right. Rather than just living with
Almost,
suicidal
okay.
thoughts, I was starting to think about how to solve the problem of being alive.
Gotcha. Okay. Wow.
And the story of like what happened is like actually one of the most intensely beautiful things that's like ever happened to me. And I don't actually.
I love how you just described that right now. Oh man, I'm gonna use that in every conversation about mental health from now on. Intensely beautiful. Oh man, I'm gonna be thinking about that for a while. All right, continue.
Awesome. So I reached out, and at this point I can't even remember like why I chose this particular person. But I reached out to a friend and mentor who actually lived across the ocean. She lives in England. And, because I had founded a support group on Facebook for people with depression, for us to just like talk about it and get support and share resources. And she had actually asked, when I'd announced that on Facebook, she'd asked to join that group because she had had her life gone off the rails by a major depression like years before. But she was healthy and, stable again. So she was providing a lot of support and love in that group. So I basically reached out to her, and it was like the middle of the night for me. It was morning in England for her. I was laying in my bed. I hadn't showered in days. And this was when, by the way, like I tried to like make my bed one day and then like collapsed on the floor. Like it was one of those things where it's like, I'm going to do a thing. Damn it. Like, I'm going to do a thing. And I made my bed and then like collapsed from the effort from it.
Wow.
Because like, I don't know if y'all know this. And by the way, like I have a bunch of resources.
I've done the same thing.
I have a bunch of resources for depression to like recommend, and I can do that like at the end of the podcast.
Okay, sweet. We'll definitely include that in a blog post
Sweet,
too.
yeah, they're great. One of the things that they finally figured out with depressed people, and it's like appalling how recent this information is, but what they realized, they finally thought to test for stress levels in people with major depression. And what they found is that the stress levels in people who are so catatonic they can't get off the couch they're astronomical.
I'm sure.
Like the body is basically convinced that it is running away from a lion 24/7. And it is expending all of its energy to run away from this imaginary lion. So you have no energy to do anything else.
Right. You're basically just expelling all of your stress hormones constantly into your brain.
Yeah. Which is why like the laundry is overwhelming, because how can you do laundry when there's a lion like chasing you in your brain? Like who has time for that?
Interesting.
So I'd like collapsed on the floor, and so I was reaching out to this friend, and I basically just like, I just opened up to her about everything. And this was actually like a friend who, we had like a spiritual connection, and that I could really talk about like more than just the implications of like ending my life, like ending my physical life. And we could talk about like energy and like, where does energy go, once the body
fascinating.
passes and all of that. And she basically...
Were you able to have like deep conversation at that point, or was it just kind of like you saying words?
I mean, I was struggling to put words together, but because of the space that I was in, like once I like actually brought my full vulnerability, like the conversation was deep because of how deep in the hole I was, I wasn't able to like think about things too much, but
Gotcha.
I was.
So when you were able to like be vulnerable with somebody, that's when you felt more free flowing of thoughts.
Oh, absolutely. Like being able to
I guess that's in general just the case. I never allowed myself to be vulnerable when I was in my most depressed state, so I just didn't talk to anybody.
Yeah, and like that makes it worse, Like
the
number one lie depression tells is that we're alone.
Right.
And then it convinces you that you're alone, so you don't reach out to anybody, so then you end up being alone, and it's a spiral.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, so I reached out to her. I told her all this stuff, and I will never, ever forget what she said. She was like, Stellar, like, we love you. But if you have to go, go.
Mhm.
I'm not going to stop you. Like, your life is your own.
Right.
Like, we would miss you dearly, but it's your life. Because I think she could tell that I was staying alive for everyone else but myself in my life.
So then how did that shift in that moment? Because clearly you stuck around.
Clearly.
Was that a moment of clarity, or did it take a while to sink in and for you to kind of shift, or like what happened when she said that?
Immediately in that moment, I felt something lift. Like, and I imagine what it was that burden of like staying alive for everyone else was what she like lifted me.
Like you finally had permission to make the choice if you wanted to.
I was free.
Yeah.
Like she freed me from the trap of being alive that my brain and body had like spun me into.
That's so interesting. So then how did you move forward after that point?
So I recognized like the spaciousness. It was like this tiny window of spaciousness opened up in me. It's like, okay, I can stick around for like a week, you know? It was just that tiny bit of space in my brain to be like, okay, I can easily imagine being alive for another week. That's no problem. And just kind of sat with it and thought about it a lot. And yeah, like what I came out of it with was this thing that I affectionately call the 5-year plan, which is what I'm still on. Which was, okay, self, pep talk. You are not allowed to kill yourself for the next 5 years. And during that time, you are going to work your ass off to make your life not be this.
Yeah.
However that looks. Because at the time, I couldn't even envision what it would look like, right? But I just knew that, like, I had to give myself, like, a chance to change, a chance to, like, heal, a chance to give myself a chance to, like, get out of the illness, So I was like, okay, for the next 5 years, you're going to do everything you can to make this not be like this. And then if at the end of 5 years, nothing has changed and this still rules your life, we can talk. Like, then maybe, like you've had a good run, you've done your best, and like, it's okay. Like maybe you can go, But, and when I did that, like something fundamental in my life shifted. Like when I was actually able to really like take suicide off the table.
Yep.
Because then what I could focus on, and I also relieved myself of like the obligation to keep existing, right? Because I just, every time things got rough, I would be like, okay, like if, like if in 5 years or 4 years or 3 years, like it's still hard, like I have that choice point. And now, of course, I mean, this is almost 2.5 years ago. So I'm a little over halfway through and I'm already imagining that in 2.5 years, like, I'm probably going to renew my lease on this existence. Again.
So you're still thinking of it that short term. It wasn't just like after a while, it was just like, all right, this little deal that I've made with myself is kind of arbitrary. You're still like sticking to it. Or did you in the first place pick like 5 as kind of like an arbitrary number, or what was your thinking? Did you ever like see that at somewhere else?
It was totally arbitrary. I mean, I just kind of I was grabbing at straws, you pick what you can work with.
That's like the classic thing that we grew up learning too, the 5-year plan. When you're in college, you have your 5-year plan.
Exactly.
Like that's the thing that we do.
You got your 1 year.
It makes perfect
and I
sense.
refer to it as the 5-year. It's the 5-year plan of staying alive.
Yeah. So I'm really interested in talking about, okay, so once you kind of started coming out of, your darkest point, I've seen you work through things, and I've seen you invest your energy in 2 things primarily, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but community and creativity. And those are the two things I would love to hear about. How you've created amazing community for yourself, both through your activism and through like the work that you do. I would love if you wanted to touch a little bit on authentic relating for a moment.
Oh, sure.
Just because I think that's a really unique tool, and I imagine that it is very useful and powerful for a lot of people. And then I'd love to hear about your creativity and your music and how those, how that's moved forward as you've kind of dug yourself out of the depths of despair.
Totally. Yeah, and those, I might have to talk about them both at the same time because they're very interwoven.
Awesome.
So during that low period, I actually found the authentic relating community for the first time and came home and wrote a song about it.
Oh, wow.
Like Hallelujah came through that first night that I came home from AR and wrote this song. And yeah, it became pretty clear to me after starting the 5-year plan. It's like, okay, if I am only going to be around for 5 more years, what in God's name am I doing not doing exactly what I want to be doing? Like that just came super alive really quickly.
Yeah.
And by the end, so that was in like January of 2015. By the end of that year, I had quit my job and like quit my apartment and gone on the road full time to do music. So it was almost like making that shift in my life just opened up space for these other things to really start happening. Because I was clear, like if I'm only going to be here for 5 years, I mean, I love my job, but I'm not going to be working in an office for the next.
That's so interesting. So you went from a place of not wanting to exist anymore into choosing, okay, well, I only have this finite amount of time to exist potentially. I'm going to stick around for for 5 years. Therefore, I don't want to waste the time that I have. But it's so interesting that it shifted from like not wanting to be here at all to then having that limit and then using that limit as a way of, holding yourself accountable to living honestly and truthfully.
And I think like part of the reason the depression was so bad was because I wasn't doing that.
Yeah.
I was living the way I think a lot of people live, which is like, oh, I have to pay rent. Oh, I have to have a job. Oh, I have to do these things. And I have to like not pursue my dreams and not pursue what is really alive in me because of this thing. And doing that, was part of the reason that I got as low as I did.
Yep.
So yeah, once I decided that that I was only gonna, possibly be here for a short amount of time, things shifted really quickly into like, okay, well, this is what I want to be doing while I'm here. And the community piece is crucial because, again, going back to like one of the biggest lies depression tells is that our experience is unique and that we're the only ones like going through what we're going through.
Yep.
It's a disease of like isolation. And coming out of that hole and like, coming into connection with others and finding out like, oh, like this is the human experience is suffering like this deep. Like everybody goes through it at some point. Some of us get really stuck in it for various reasons that like aren't our fault. But yeah, like the music has been a huge part of my healing. In that, I mean, just sound itself, like singing is actually the most healing thing that I know. Because you're moving sound vibrationally, like through your physical body, and it impacts like all of your systems. It opens up things that are stuck. It like brings up feelings that have been buried, and it impacts others and opens them up and like creates a space where like connection can happen. And I think one of the biggest antidotes like to loneliness and depression is connection.
Yep.
But it's difficult because when we're in those really depressed states, connection is like the last thing we have energy for.
Yeah, it's the opposite of what you want.
It's the opposite of what you want when you're in those states. And it's like actually one of the things that is the most healing. So it's a real catch-22 in that way. Um, yeah, and what I found is that like sharing my story and like actually, coming into a space and like getting real
Mhm.
and like sharing what was really going on. I mean, it was so edgy and painful to do. And I'm sure I didn't always like do it like gracefully or well.
Do you want to give, because I hear you talking a little bit about authentic relating and kind of the games, but do you want to give a little bit of context for people who don't know what that is?
Sure. Authentic relating is a community, a disparate, far-flung community all over the United States and somewhat over the world that has formed around these sets of games and processes that kind of come from like all over. They've been collected, and also some of them have been invented within the community that teach like communication skills and that encourage people to bring like their full self to interactions with others and to get curious about other people's full selves and to like encourage a space of meeting each other in a space of like vulnerability and authenticity and like curiosity and caring is really how I would. Is that?
Yes, keep going. I just wanted to mention
totally
what it was before moving forward.
Right. And yeah, so I in those spaces and out of those spaces, I just started like sharing my story more. And because I was convinced, right? Like if I bring this part of myself, if I'm this vulnerable, I'm going to be turned away. Like people don't want to hear this. They want to see your shiny side. Like they want to see me all put together. These were like the thoughts that I was operating under. And
Tyler relates.
And I want to name that like often that's true. Like it depends on what circles you're hanging out in, but there are circles where like you can't bring your struggles. It's not allowed.
Yeah, it's really difficult often to be less than perfect, like you said. Shiny is a great word for it.
Shiny.
And in a lot of situations, I feel like even with the best intentions, often it's that people don't necessarily know how to receive when someone else in their life is feeling uncomfortable or upset or sad without maybe thinking that they're doing something wrong or that there's something personal about the relationship that they have that ties into the other person's headspace, or places like professional places. Like you can't often, if you have a work environment where you can show up and say, hey, I'm feeling depressed or I need to take a mental health day, that's amazing,
right?
And it's unfortunately not very common.
It's not the standard at all.
But
so I think it just depends on like your context. So like if you have a previous context with your relationships with these people, typically like they don't want to like just learn that you were suicidal for a while and like almost we're in very deep dark places, and they don't want to hear all of like those parts about you necessarily because it is scary. But a lot of times I think in general just everybody wants to hear those kind of authentic and open things if they have like no prior context. So like just being vulnerable and out of the ordinary, like it's attractive to people. Like people are like, I wish that I could be that open and vulnerable about myself, is usually the reactions I get when I like come up next to somebody in like a restaurant, or I just start talking to I don't know, on the phone to this girl who's trying to just confirm a doctor's appointment. I'm just like, how are you genuinely doing today?
How are you really?
And then just like just being able to like share like little blurbs of like vulnerability, and then you get their story. I talked to some this just happened literally yesterday. Talked to some like 60-year-old lady outside of like my psychiatrist's office, and like she had just gone in, and like I picked up while she was in, she was feeling depressed, obviously, where that's normal. And like coming out, like I was walking away and I see her like eating something like on at a chair. I'm just like, how'd it go? And she's just like, it went. And just like after, like, she's like, they think I'm nuts. I'm like, I'm nuts. And so I was like, me too. We're all kind of nuts in there. And just like that you have some type of camaraderie, so it's a different type of context. But in general, like, I just was like, she just kind of expected that, like, she was almost alone a little bit, and was like, yeah, I've been there. I'm bipolar, and I was suicidal for a couple months, and she's just like her demeanor just changed, and then she immediately went into her story. So when you're vulnerable to about yourself to other people, it just, like, it's natural to reciprocate it, and you make it an environment for other people to be open. And I think that's really cool. I think that's one of the main reasons we're doing this podcast. So I think you can relate.
Totally. That's exactly what I found, is that rather than rejecting me, people, like, wanted to get closer.
Mm-hmm.
Like they themselves opened up, and, like, seeing the vulnerability in me, they were inspired to then share, like, their stories and their struggles. And
ooh, here's a question for you that I've been wondering. Do you sometimes, like, not share your story on purpose to certain people because you know, like, it's such an edgy, attractive story that you think that these people might be more attracted to you just because of your story rather than your personality?
Oh, interesting. That's
wow, what
reverse.
a question.
It's the opposite.
Because I've done that a couple times. I'm just like, I don't want this girl to like me just because I got a cool story and I'm transformed. I just want her to know that, like, I'm a person.
That's fascinating.
That is fascinating. I think I know what you mean.
Have you thought about it like that before?
I mean, there's definitely people that I don't share my story with because I don't, and I guess it's like a similar thing. Like, I don't necessarily trust, like, how they're going to receive it.
Right. You don't want to be extremely vulnerable with them.
Like, you think they're going to do it in a negative way or a positive way?
Both, sometimes. Sometimes I don't share because...
Okay, so it is the same fear.
Yeah, sometimes I don't share because, you know, I intuit that, like, they're not going to be able to handle it, or, like, they don't want to hear it, you know? But then other times, I don't... I mean, I always share my story if I can sense that someone else is suffering. You know?
Yeah,
that's
course.
legit, like, always a thing. But yeah, like, if I feel like a person is going to have kind of like a glomming on response, or like like, all of a sudden they're attracted to me, or, like, falling in love with this idea of, like, who I was or the struggle that I went through. I think I can relate to that a little bit.
Yeah, because I do that because I feel like I do that sometimes with other people, because it's just natural for humans to connect to stories, but it's harder for some people to, like, overcome that urge to be connected to an idea rather than an individual.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Well, making a podcast was a perfect solution, Tyler.
Yeah. Oh man. Oh no.
The real motivation for this podcast comes out.
Revealed.
Oh no. You're getting me coughing.
Revealed.
I'm too sick for this.
Yeah, actually, that's a
okay.
great segue unintentionally. So Tyler May has been a little sick, and we were going to record earlier this week, and he couldn't talk. So
hello, Tyler May.
It was very
it was cracking all over
very
the place.
cracky voice.
Yeah, it sounded like a pubescent 11-year-old.
And I actually wanted to segue that into asking Stellar a couple questions about physical health and kind of where your body is at in relation to depression, because we've sort of touched on this a little bit, and I know that she's had quite a few experiences that have proven to have those two elements of be very interrelated: her mental health and her physical health, and her relationship to her mind and body in that process. That's a very vague question, but do you think that you can share a few thoughts about those
I'm sure I
things?
can say words about it. Yeah, there's that phrase, like, it's all in your head, right? And that phrase is a complete lie.
Not true. What have you discovered about, actually, this is better. I can actually rephrase the question in a real question. What have you discovered about how your physical well-being relates to your mental health?
Yes.
Better, right?
Clearer.
Good job. Claps.
And it's so funny answering this question, because the people who told me these things while I was locked in deep depression, I wanted to punch them in the face. So I just need to like preface this by saying that I totally get and understand that. But I think what they've, I would love to like discover that I'm depressed now, because it seems like there are so many more resources available now than there were like 10 years ago, like when I was first diving into it. But
That's great news.
I know they have discovered recently, pretty conclusively, that depression and inflammation are very linked in the body. That depression is an inflammation response to something else going on. And so what I began to, obviously I began to notice like things like sugar and like certain foods would like make my episodes worse. Nights when I could sleep versus nights when I couldn't sleep made a huge difference. But yeah, that like the depression is a physical disease, possibly even more than a mental disease, is I think what they're really starting to treat it from that perspective.
Interesting.
And that there are a lot of things like diet. I'm not even going to bother to say exercise, because telling a depressed person to exercise is the opposite of what you should be doing. If you're doing that, please stop.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to do.
Please stop.
I like to aim for take a 5-minute walk.
Right.
Because that's exercise and it gets things moving, but it's manageable.
Yeah.
It's conceivable if you're depressed.
I say move your body.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, get out of bed and maybe shower once every 3 days if you're
Right.
not doing that.
and there's really, there's checklists, right? That like I go through in my brain now when I feel it coming on, is like, drink a glass of water. Have you showered today? Have you moved your body? Have you stretched? Have you talked to someone? Have you connected with someone? Have you hugged someone?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Like there's just all these things that I go through in my head. And usually if I can do like 3 to 5 of them, something shifts. It's not like the depression's gone, but the thing that is both panic and spiral downward at the same time, like usually abates a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing what just brushing your teeth and taking a shower can do when you haven't really done anything in days.
Exactly. And yeah, like, and the physical thing is tough because, when you're that depressed, like eating is hard. And so going back again to like the vulnerability of like opening up to people and like asking for help, right? Like it's so hard. It's so impossible for most of us. But if there's even a way to like have a friend like come over and like you can cook together, you can like make food together. Or, you can just like having a friend to come over and like hang out and like watch a movie and do nothing. There are these little ways that we can like treat and help our physical bodies that are really impactful for our mental health.
Yes.
But for me, yeah, inflammation is a thing that I've really been working with in my life as far as like finding sources and physical sources and causes of inflammation and like decreasing it. So definitely like changing a lot of the things that I love to eat, not eating them anymore. Taking walks more frequently, yoga, stretching, anything to like move the blood and energy around in my body is definitely a crucial component to like maintaining. And then you were speaking, Laura, about like the relationship like to depression, right?
Yeah, that's something else that you and I have talked about a lot that I would love to touch on in this is your kind of internal dialogue relationship to your own mind and thoughts and experience of depression.
Yeah. I remember the first time that I realized that I was hearing thoughts in my head that weren't true.
Like negative narrative, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like, because the negative narrative is so overpowering. It's so strong, right?
Yeah.
It seems like truth.
Yeah.
And it's a skill, right? Like it's something that we have to practice. It's not something that any of us, especially those of us in a severely depressed state, like it's not a skill that we have. It's something we have to like just start doing and failing and doing and failing and keep like trying to do.
The skill is to notice.
To like hear the thoughts and be like, oh, I don't have to believe you.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're not necessarily true.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I see you. You know, that process of like pulling yourself out from being the thoughts and believing the thoughts to be like, oh yeah, you jokers.
These
know
are just
you.
thoughts. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
I feel like literally like one of the best ways that you can help solve depression problems is just self-talk. Like you have to combat those the negative narrative with that, because once you have like the first thoughts, then you continue to have the next thoughts, and like as we've talked about, like it just spirals from there. But if you're able to like cut it off from the beginning, I feel like these problems just begin by us reacting to a situation or our own selves or something outside of our control, just in a bad way, where we just let it get to us too much, and then we start to think negatively, and then we kind of have that negative narrative that's not true, and we talk lies to ourselves, and then we let that fester. But if you can cut it off before like you get to that large negative narrative, then you can do a whole lot for yourself.
absolutely. And it's funny, like hearing you say like cut it off, like it for me it's a fine balance, because what I first started doing when I started trying to get control back of those thoughts was I was like super mean to those thoughts. You know, of like, oh, you, like, no, like get out of here. Like I was coming from that same sort of like self-loathing energy that was like actually fueling
totally
the depression, you know?
Right.
So for me, it's like a fine line of like, I kind of think of it as like when I hear those thoughts coming up, I'm like, okay, it's like we're in a car, right? You don't get to drive. You don't even get to sit in the navigation seat. You thoughts get to sit in the back seat, and I'm going to give you like a book or an iPhone or like something to distract yourself with, because I'm driving.
Yeah.
And I'm deciding where we go. But I'm not throwing you out of the car because like you're part of me, and I somehow have to figure out like how to love you and how to be gentle with you.
Yeah. It's like you get to sit in the child seat in the back.
Yes.
I've heard a lot of people.
But I'm gonna make sure you're really strapped in with that child safety belt, though.
And you have enough food, like you have water, you're great, you're fine. You just don't get to sit up front.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people actually use the metaphor of the inner child, right, when talking about how to confront those thoughts and how to shift them away from taking over. It's like you approach it as if you were talking to, you know, a 3-year-old, which hopefully is with compassion and kindness and this really gentle, loving energy of like, oh, hey, I see you. I hear you. I understand right now that you think the world is going to end and you're freaking out.
Right.
And you think you're a failure and all of these things, but I love you. So just sit in the back seat and I'm going to drive. You know, it's like, and that actually for me is really hard to do.
Accessing compassion in that way.
Oh, it's so hard.
When you're in the middle of those thoughts is like, again, it's a skill.
Yeah. But you can do it for other people, right? Like, I think that's what's so interesting about the way that humans seem to be wired is that it's often easier for us to, you know, reach out and be compassionate and hold space for somebody else who's suffering or struggling than it is for us to be really kind to ourselves.
Absolutely.
You know, and that's why I really love that little child metaphor, because it's like it kind of externalizes it as something other than yourself so that you can interact with it that way.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of times when I talk to people who are like struggling with a problem or an issue like depression, I just ask them, well, what would you tell somebody like in your own circumstances? And like that just makes it way easier for them to be able to realize it. But I think it's a lot more helpful to not just say like, no, you shouldn't be thinking this way, kind of get in the back seat. I don't really use that metaphor. I know it's really helpful to like think of it that way, but it's not enough. We can all agree to just like use that negative energy and say no and like try to cut it off by just saying no. We have to talk positive thoughts into it. So you have to combat. It's not just negative versus positive too. It's combating lies with
Absolutely.
truth. So it's not enough to say, man, red houses are the worst. I hate red houses. Like, get out of here, dumb red houses. It's like, stop. You have to be like, you know what? I don't have to just hate red houses. Like, I kind of like blue houses. Blue houses are nice, man. I want to live in like a blue house, or like look at more blue houses. Like, you gotta kind of look at that. Like, what can you do that's the opposite of what you're currently doing to yourself, which is self-destruction, ultimately. Yeah.
My phrase for it is, this is real, but it's not reality.
Oh, that's good.
Snaps. Write a poem about it. I'm sure you've written songs.
I've written
that.
some poetry about that one. But yeah, and to me, it like encompasses the validity, like, of those thoughts. Like, it's okay. Like, I hear that I am suffering. I hear that you're suffering. Like, that it's real, but it's not reality.
Yeah.
It's not true. Like, the things that you're thinking to yourself are not
that's
the
so
truth.
good. Oh man. This entire podcast was worth that little nugget. So mark it down in your time code.
48 something.
I kind of want to dive more into the creative and community side again, because you had somebody basically bring you out of that depths of despair by like essentially speaking truth to you. And then you wanted to basically share your stories with others, if I'm recalling it correctly. And that's essentially my experience. I had somebody kind of bring me out of myself, or help bring me out of myself, because ultimately it's your choice and what you do that actually gets you there. But I had that, and then I wanted to share all of my experiences with everyone so that I could in turn help them, because I know how much it sucked to be in those places, and I don't want anybody to ever come close to those places. So is that kind of similar? And like, what were the things that you turned to after you kind of came out of depression? What were you saying to these people in your communities and through creativity?
So I think the first song that I wrote from that place of like, okay, I'm actually just gonna bring exactly where I'm at was Leaves, actually. A song that Laura and I performed together. I wrote after, when I was in the middle of an episode, a friend basically like begged me. She was like, "You're a musician. Like, please write yourself a song that you can sing to yourself when things get really dark."
Oh, that's so sweet.
Like, please, you know? And I was really depressed when she asked me that, right? So I was like, oh, like, I hate that. Like, no, I don't want to do that.
But then you did it, right?
I did, yeah. I mean, I received and felt the truth of what she was saying. And yeah, within the next month or so, Leaves was born.
Wow.
I think for me, part of it was even realizing that I had anything worthwhile to say to begin with. You know?
Whoa.
Because obviously depression makes you think that you're just worthless and that you have nothing to say.
Did you kind of get that feeling like immediately, or did it take a while to kind of realize that?
It took a while.
Okay.
It took a while of me like starting to share my art, starting to share my stories, cringing in anticipation of the response. And then people being like, hey, that's really inspiring. Like, I'm really glad you're doing that. I feel I've been impacted at XYZ. And then me being like, oh, like maybe I'm not like a completely worthless piece of a human. Maybe I actually have something to say. And so just building from there. I feel like now the music, I have a very like non-ownership relationship with the music that I write. Sometimes I don't even feel like I'm the one writing it.
So you have a non-ownership even when you're writing it, not just after it's done?
Oh yeah, like as I'm writing a song, like it actually feels more like I'm just listening for the song.
Interesting. I'm the opposite. I'm like this is all mine. I'm not even gonna share this with anybody. It's too vulnerable.
I definitely don't share everything that comes through.
Yeah, But I still have that. Like, I have a huge possessive trait towards songs and other creative things that I write.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think for me, like, and again, it goes back to like that sort of externalization thing. And actually, Elizabeth Gilbert has an amazing TED Talk about this subject. It's tangentially about depression, because what she's talking about is the problem of like suicide and depression among artists and creators.
Yep.
And her thesis is that part of what fuels that is the way we relate to our art and our creativity, in that we actually think of it as ours, because then we like put all this pressure on ourselves to create something good.
Yeah.
And when it's good, like, it's like, oh, we're so great. But when it's bad, like, we're worthless and nothing and like can't create, you know? So there's something, I think she calls it like a protective mechanism, where when you externalize like the source of creativity, which is what like the Greeks and Romans did, right? With the muses and the daemons. And the genius was the word for it in Rome, actually.
Right.
But you weren't a genius, you had a genius.
Right. Which was like a little thing that came and inspired you.
Yeah,
was a genius an actual...
It was like the force of creativity that like lived in your walls, you know? And she's really funny in the talk. She's like, yeah, like everyone knew that this is how creativity worked. So like, you know, if an artist made a great thing, couldn't take all the credit because everyone knew that like the genius or the daemon had helped. And if your work sucked, like, not entirely your fault. Like your genius was a little bit cockeyed, you know, like kind of lame. Like, oh, well.
I love that. That sounds awesome.
And she has I'll just tell you to go watch the TED Talk, because she has an amazing story about Tom Waits as well, and his relationship to his music in that way. But yeah, when I started doing that, it actually like relieved a lot of the internal pressure that I was putting on myself to like make good art. And it freed me up to just make the art that like wanted to come out of me, and I could like stop judging it and therefore stop judging myself as much. And it's not to say that like I still don't judge hardcore everything that like comes out of my mouth, right? Yeah. But it's a process. And what I find again and again
sounds like a much healthier way of doing things than I've been doing.
It seems healthier because I seem healthier, you know? Like I seem to have more of a just more of a loving and free and like productive relationship with my art. And like what I find again and again is just like when people receive art that has been created like from the heart and just from a space of like art that I create when I'm like super judgmental and like suffering, like tends to like not be good.
Yep.
Like people don't respond to it as much. Whereas like the art that I open myself up to be a channel for, and just kind of like have this like, okay, like I've been through what I've been through. I'm still here. I'm just going to like open up and listen. People seem to respond to that art in a very different way.
So is that mostly like are those mostly like first person type songs of like, I've gone through this, or is it more of like, since you're doing that way, it's more of like, this is a thing happening, and more of like a we, like third person?
Definitely
type of
more of a we. I mean, I've written a lot of songs from the perspective of I. And people love those songs, and they're valuable because we all have that I perspective, you know? But songs that are kind of also more about the meta and more about inviting people into a we space.
I find that's a lot easier to do than doing the I space, because you're so kind of selfish and focused on like making it good because it is you and about you, that it takes longer, man. I could talk to you for hours. Let's be friends, Stellar.
Okay. Yay, we're friends.
What we definitely want to get into, I don't know how long this will take, so I'll just ask it now, is just what would you say is probably the worst thing that you had to deal with going through just your journey with mental health in general, and maybe even having to do with your time being suicidal? And then you can later answer what was the best thing. But we usually try to take the bad first and then end off on a good note. But what's kind of the worst, would you say, of dealing with your mental illness?
Can I think about it for a minute?
Sure.
Usually, we like to just have this little mini recap at the end of the show that's like, what's the worst thing about, and what's your superpower that you've gained?
Oh, I love it.
So that then at the end, people are framing it with like, it makes me greatly empathetic or whatever, you know.
Mhm.
Yeah, think about it for a second, and then Tyler can just re-ask the question.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I got it.
Right. So one of the things we like to do here a lot is just to kind of ask, what is the worst thing? That sounds bad. One of the things we like to do here is ask people, what are the worst things about your life?
I'm in.
But we do. We want to know what's kind of the worst thing that you've had to go through with your mental illness, and then we'll get to the best part. But we'll take the bad first, and then go to the good, so people can kind of learn from your experience. So, what's the worst thing that you've had to deal with your mental illness?
I think it was just living for years with this constant internal dialogue of you're worthless and you don't deserve to be alive. I think that was probably like the hardest thing to live with while it was really bad.
It's so easy to sum up of just like, yeah, I had 2 years where I was like, just felt worthless, and people are like, oh, that's bad. But like, when you think about it and you remember those times, you're like, literally every day, almost 24/7 of feeling worthless day in and day out. Like, it is the absolute worst.
Sounds exhausting.
It is. It's so just endlessly exhausting. And one of the, like, it's not a regret, but sometimes I just like take a moment to think about like how much energy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to say wasted because nothing is wasted, but how much energy I expended.
Yeah.
I lost.
How much energy like could have been gained? Like what could have you could have used that time so much to doing like what you love doing.
Totally.
But then like I'm like, you know what, it doesn't matter. Like, don't feel guilty over the past. Like, just move on and do the stuff.
Well,
you love. So that's kind of
where I'm at with that is like, oh, I know for a fact that it wasn't wasted energy because I know that I wouldn't be who I am today and I wouldn't be doing any of the things that I'm doing if it wasn't for those years.
Yep.
You know.
Yeah. You have to get that low sometimes in order to get where you're at. I think that's pretty cool. So what's the best thing that you've had about your mental illness, and what's the best result that's come from it?
I'm trying to figure out a way to say this that like isn't just like totally woo. But I really do feel like I met my own soul.
Whoa.
In that process.
Ooh.
Like, I think I was like vaguely aware that like I was supposed to have a soul or something, you know? I'd been around spiritual people for years. I'd been raised by spiritual parents. You know, I had been taught that like this is a thing. You know, we are spiritual beings having a physical experience and all of that. But I feel like I didn't really get it until until I went through that period in my life. There's a way in which I now feel like, because of all of that disconnection, coming out the other side of it, there's a way I feel like so much more connected, like to other people and to myself and to like the world around me. And I just want to go ahead and say, like, for the record, that I think if you're like awake and alive and paying attention in the world today, like, you're dealing with depression. like
It's true. It's rather intense times.
You know, like, we are not meant to process the amount of suffering that is both happening and that we are exposed to on a daily basis in the world.
That is
as modern humans. And I also think
everything's pretty.
I also think depression like is a disease of like the industrialized capitalist world. You know, from everything from like the food to the stress to the lifestyle to the loneliness. Like, we as humans did not evolve to live this way. And like, I think way more people live with this illness than admit it or realize it or that anyone else like knows about. So in that sense, like, I feel very much not alone anymore. Because I know that part of the illness is like, it's part of just being alive right now in these times, and having the care and empathy and compassion that, we clearly all have because y'all are making this podcast about mental health, right?
Yeah.
So I think in some ways just being awake in the world is enough to cause an experience of depression. And it's something that that we all need to work through in our own ways.
Yeah. So you kind of feel like you've become more having that dualistic frame of thinking of just like connecting the soul and the body. Is that kind of more of like, is that kind of a good summation of what you're trying to say with the soul?
I would actually say I've become way more non-dual. I've gone beyond the dualistic like soul body, because I think before I was severely depressed, I was way more dualistic. I was like in a physical body, and the soul was like this mental concept, that I didn't like feel like I had a connection to. And now it's like, to me, body, soul, world, people, like they're all very much more intertwined. I would say I live a very much more non-dual from a more non-dual perspective now than I did before.
Yeah.
And that is an immense gift. Oh, and the other thing, the final thing, the best thing that I think I've gained from that experience is that I'm actually no longer afraid of dying.
Woo.
Like, to have come that close to death, or the potential for death, and to have like accepted like, oh, I may die soon, or like I may not be here soon. There's a way now that I just feel like so alive in the world.
Yeah.
To have
kind of like you're on extra time,
right.
Almost, because
I'm
all
living
of
on
this,
extra time now. Like it really does feel that
Yeah.
way, and that feels like an amazing gift every day.
Yeah, I feel that every moment is just kind of a gift from now on. And like, if I died, it's just like, you know what, I probably should have, or I probably would have died earlier. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
I've done
shoulda.
quite a bit in just like the past one. No, yeah, exactly.
No,
I'm correcting
it's
myself.
Like
constantly.
if I were to leave the planet tomorrow, like, I would be disappointed, right? There's so much that like I want to stay here to do. But it's like, you know what? All right, good job, kid. Like you did all right.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I hope that everybody is doing all right, and just want to tell you all, good job, kid.
Good job, kid.
Hope you're doing all right.
You're still here. Good job.
Yep. We're still here. You're not alone, and thank you for listening, and thank you, Stella, for joining us. You can tell that my voice is kind of increasingly getting worse and worse. So I'm glad that we've reached the end of this. Although I could talk to you for days.
Aw, thanks for having me on, y'all. This is great. I love what you're doing.
For
All
being
right. Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.